At her granddaughter's wedding, Margaret Whitmore looked down at the cream-colored card pinned to her silk jacket and saw that instead of grandmother of the bride, it read, in elegant gold script, the sponsor. She did not flinch, did not sigh, did not remove it. She simply adjusted the edge of the card so it sat straight against the soft blue fabric and walked into the Charleston ballroom as if nothing at all had shifted inside her. The reception hall glowed with crystal chandeliers and strings of white roses cascading from tall centerpieces, and a string quartet near the terrace doors played something light and celebratory, while waiters in pressed black jackets carried trays of champagne. Margaret had written the largest checks for this evening over the past 8 months, covering everything from the 5-tier cake to the waterfront venue that overlooked the harbor. Yet as she stepped onto the polished floor, she felt less like family and more like a line item in a budget. Guests greeted her politely, some with warm smiles, others with curious glances that lingered half a second too long on the word pinned to her chest. "It's such a generous gift," one woman whispered to her husband, not softly enough. They couldn't have done it without her. Margaret smiled in the practiced way she had learned over decades of board meetings and charity galas, a smile that revealed nothing and protected everything. Across the room, her daughter-in-law Lauren stood near the sweetheart table, radiant in a tailored emerald gown, directing vendors with subtle hand gestures as if orchestrating a production. Daniel, Margaret's son, laughed beside her, unaware of the small, precise cut that had just been delivered to his mother's identity. Margaret remembered the day Lauren had insisted on handling the seating chart and name cards personally, saying she wanted every detail to be perfect. At the time, Margaret had admired the dedication. Now she wondered if perfection had meant something different to Lauren than it did to her. She moved toward a table near the back, the place assigned to her, not among immediate family but beside 2 distant cousins and an elderly neighbor from the groom's side. The chair felt slightly unsteady on the hardwood floor, rocking by a fraction of an inch, and Margaret steadied it with the tip of her heel before sitting down. From the head table, Emily beamed, luminous in ivory lace, unaware of the quiet redefinition happening 100 feet away. When the master of ceremonies tapped his glass and thanked those who made tonight possible, several guests turned toward Margaret with appreciative nods, as though she were a corporate benefactor rather than the woman who had rocked the bride to sleep during thunderstorms 23 years ago. Margaret lifted her champagne flute and took a measured sip, letting the bubbles fade on her tongue before placing the glass back on the linen tablecloth. She did not correct anyone. She did not seek out Daniel. She did not ask Lauren for an explanation. Instead, she observed, the way she had learned to observe markets before investing, patterns before committing. The word sponsor shimmered under the chandelier lights, and in its reflection she saw something clarifying rather than cruel, a role assigned without her consent. And as the applause swelled for the newlyweds' first dance, Margaret sat perfectly still, understanding for the first time that a title can quietly rearrange a life without raising a single voice. The applause for the first dance swelled and softened like a tide, and Margaret remained seated while other guests rose instinctively, phones lifted to capture the moment. She watched Emily's veil catch the warm light from the chandeliers and thought of the afternoons she had spent hemming prom dresses and baking birthday cakes in a modest kitchen 20 miles inland, long before waterfront venues and custom floral installations became part of the family vocabulary. A waiter approached her table with a silver tray of crab cakes and miniature lobster rolls, and he smiled at her name card before saying, "Thank you for making tonight possible, ma'am." His tone was respectful, even kind, yet the words settled over her shoulders like a coat she had not chosen. Margaret nodded and accepted a napkin, folding it carefully across her lap as though precision could steady the slight tremor in her hands. From across the room, she noticed Lauren leaning toward a group of guests from the country club, laughing softly, one hand resting on Daniel's arm in a gesture that appeared affectionate and confident at once. Daniel glanced toward his mother only once, offering a small wave that did not quite reach his eyes before turning back to the conversation. Margaret remembered when he was 8 years old and had clutched her hand before. His first piano recital, whispering that he could not go on stage without her. Now he stood easily under the gaze of hundreds while she occupied a quiet corner table meant for acquaintances. During dinner service, speeches began, each one polished and sentimental. The best man thanked the bride's incredible support system, and Lauren later lifted her glass to express gratitude to everyone who contributed in their own special way. There was another ripple of appreciative glances toward Margaret, a soft chorus of knowing smiles, as if the role of benefactor was both obvious and sufficient. No one mentioned the nights she had sat with Emily while Daniel and Lauren traveled for business conferences, or the summers Margaret had paid for music camps and college application tutors without ever announcing it. She listened to the words drift across the ballroom and recognized the subtle shift in narrative. History had been edited gently, without malice loud enough to protest, but with intention quiet enough to endure. When the band transitioned to a lively swing tune, couples filled the dance floor, and Margaret remained seated for a moment longer, observing the patterns of movement the way she once studied financial statements before making an investment decision. Every gesture, every thank you, every careful omission formed a pattern that was no longer accidental. She rose eventually and walked toward the terrace doors, stepping outside into the humid coastal air where the scent of salt water mixed with gardenias. The harbor lights shimmered against the dark surface of the water, and for the first time that evening she allowed her smile to fade completely. She did not feel anger as much as clarity, a precise understanding that titles can reshape relationships more effectively than arguments ever could. Inside, the music continued, bright and celebratory, while Margaret stood alone beneath the string lights. Feeling the quiet recalibration of her place within her own family, Margaret remained on the terrace long enough for the evening breeze to cool the warmth in her cheeks. And as she stood beneath the string lights, she allowed her thoughts to travel backward over the past year with the same careful attention she once gave to balancing her household budget. The first conversation about the wedding had taken place at her dining room table 11 months earlier, when Emily, bright with excitement, had described a simple ceremony in a local church followed by a modest reception at a lakeside inn 30 miles from home. Margaret had smiled at the idea and offered to contribute, expecting to help with flowers or perhaps the rehearsal dinner. Within weeks, however, the plans had shifted. Lauren had introduced a professional wedding planner from Charleston, someone who specialized in waterfront venues and custom imported linens, and the guest list had grown from 100 to nearly 300. Each adjustment arrived wrapped in enthusiasm and reassurance. Daniel would say, "It is a once-in-a-lifetime event," and Lauren would add gently, "We just want it to be perfect for Emily." The invoices began appearing in Margaret's mailbox, thick envelopes listing deposits and final balances, numbers that climbed steadily into 6 figures. When she hesitated, Lauren would sit beside her and explain the upgrades in patient detail, describing handcrafted centerpieces, live musicians, and a curated menu featuring fresh seafood flown in from the Pacific coast. Margaret had written the checks without protest, telling herself that generosity was a form of love, and that love did not require recognition. Now, standing outside while laughter drifted through the open doors, she revisited small moments she had once dismissed. She remembered asking about seating arrangements and being told kindly that it was already handled. She remembered offering to give a toast and hearing that the schedule was full, but that her presence alone meant everything. Even the wording on the formal invitation had listed her name at the bottom in smaller print, beneath the parents of the bride and groom, as if her role were supplemental rather than foundational. None of those details had seemed sharp on their own. Together they formed a clear outline. Inside the ballroom, the band began a slower melody, and couples swayed beneath the chandeliers while photographers captured every embrace. Margaret realized that the evening had been carefully curated, not only in decor and music, but in narrative. The story being told celebrated youth, romance, and polished success, and her contribution fit neatly into a single, convenient category. She was the financial pillar, reliable and discreet, present but not central. As she inhaled the salt-tinged air and listened to the muffled applause echo across the terrace, Margaret felt something settle within her with quiet certainty. She had not been excluded by accident. She had been positioned deliberately, assigned a role that required her resources, but not her voice. And for the first time since the planning began, she understood that the most important decision of the night would not be made on the dance floor, but in the calm, deliberate choices she would make once the music stopped. Margaret returned to the ballroom with the same measured composure she had carried for decades, her shoulders relaxed and her expression serene, as though the cool night air had been taken merely to admire the harbor lights rather than to steady her thoughts. The band had shifted into an upbeat classic that drew nearly every guest onto the dance floor, and the energy in the room pulsed with celebration. She moved along the perimeter of the room, offering polite smiles when eyes met hers, accepting a few compliments about the elegance of the evening, as if she were a distant patron of the arts rather than the bride's grandmother. Near the bar, she overheard a conversation between two guests discussing the honeymoon plan for the following week, a 10-day escape to the Amalfi Coast with private tours and oceanfront accommodations. Her grandmother made that possible, one of them said matter-of-factly, as though referencing a grant from a foundation. Margaret paused only briefly before continuing toward her table, the words neither surprising nor entirely painful anymore, simply confirming what she had already concluded on the terrace. A few minutes later, Daniel approached her, his tie slightly loosened from dancing, his face flushed with excitement. He thanked her for coming and said the evening would not have been possible without her support. The phrasing was sincere, yet it echoed the language of sponsorship brochures more than that of family gratitude. Margaret listened carefully, noting what he did not say. He did not mention her years of care, her steady presence after his father passed away, or the countless Saturdays she had spent driving Emily to piano lessons 15 miles across town. Lauren joined them, radiant and composed, and gently suggested that a photographer capture a quick picture of the generous grandmother. The phrase was spoken with a smile, wrapped in sweetness, yet it landed with precision. Margaret agreed to the photograph, standing slightly to the side as Lauren positioned herself and Daniel at the center. The camera flashed, preserving an image that would later appear in a leather-bound album, a silent record of rolls. Carefully arranged. As the night moved forward and the cake was cut, Margaret observed the subtle choreography of inclusion and exclusion. Toasts flowed easily, laughter rose and fell, and yet no one invited her to the head table. No one asked her to share a memory of Emily's childhood. She realized that the absence was not accidental oversight but deliberate design, an unspoken agreement about where she belonged in the hierarchy of the evening. When the final dance was announced and guests began collecting their coats, Margaret retrieved her small clutch from the table and slipped the name card from her jacket, placing it neatly inside. She did not crumple it or discard it. She preserved it, as one might preserve a receipt. The gesture was quiet, almost invisible, yet it marked a turning point more significant than any speech delivered that night. As she stepped toward the exit, the chandeliers reflected softly in the polished floor, and Margaret understood with calm certainty that acknowledgment is not the same as appreciation, and generosity, without boundaries, eventually rewrites its own definition. Margaret did not wait for Daniel to notice her departure. She stepped out of the ballroom just as the final notes of music faded and the newlyweds were escorted through a corridor of sparklers toward their waiting car. The night air felt heavier now, thick with humidity rising from the harbor, and she moved carefully down the stone walkway in low heels that had carried her through decades of charity dinners and corporate fundraisers without ever betraying discomfort. A valet brought her sedan around, and as she settled into the driver's seat, she placed the folded name card on the passenger side beside her handbag, aligning it with deliberate precision before turning the key in the ignition. The drive back to her home in Mount Pleasant took 25 minutes along quiet coastal roads, and the steady rhythm of streetlights passing overhead gave her time to organize her thoughts with the same discipline she once applied to long-term financial planning. She did not replay the evening with anger. Instead, she assessed it. She noted the language used, the positioning in photographs, the omission from speeches, the framing of her contribution. By the time she pulled into her driveway, a pale blue ranch-style house she had paid off 12 years earlier, her mind was clear. Inside, the house greeted her with familiar stillness. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, and framed photographs lined the walls, including one of Emily at age 5 holding a fishing pole nearly as tall as she was. Margaret slipped off her shoes and walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water before sitting at the oak table where so many family discussions had once taken place. She removed the name card from her purse and set it flat against the wood surface. The words shimmered faintly under the overhead light. She reached for her phone and scrolled through recent messages from Lauren, each one filled with cheerful updates about floral arrangements and catering tastings, each ending with gratitude for her generosity. There had been warmth in those messages, but not once had there been acknowledgment of her role beyond financial support. Margaret did not feel the need to confront anyone in the middle of the night. Instead, she opened the small leather planner she kept beside the telephone and turned to Monday morning. She wrote down a single appointment at 10 o'clock with Robert Hayes, the family attorney who had managed her estate and trust for over 15 years. Beneath his name, she added 2 words: review structure. The phrase was simple, yet it carried weight. Margaret understood that generosity without clarity invites assumption, and assumption hardens into expectation. As the clock chimed 11, she gathered the photographs from the hallway and studied them one by one, not with sorrow but with perspective. Families evolve, narratives shift, and roles are reassigned when left undefined. She returned the frames to their places and turned off the kitchen light. Upstairs, she paused beside the window overlooking her backyard, where oak trees stood tall and unmoved by coastal winds. Margaret felt a quiet steadiness settle within her, not the sharp resolve of retaliation, but the calm intention of recalibration. Tomorrow would not require raised voices or dramatic declarations. It would require a conversation conducted across a polished conference table, measured in clauses and signatures rather than emotions. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a faint breeze moving through the oak trees outside Margaret's kitchen window, and by 9:30 she was already seated in her car, the leather folder containing her estate documents resting neatly on the passenger seat. She wore a tailored beige suit she reserved for serious appointments, not out of vanity but out of habit, because she believed clarity of purpose began with presentation. Robert Hayes's office stood in a quiet brick building 10 miles from her home, overlooking a manicured lawn bordered by low hedges trimmed with exact symmetry. When Margaret entered the reception area, the assistant greeted her warmly, having known her for years, and within minutes Robert emerged from his office with a firm handshake and a look of professional attentiveness. They sat across from one another at a polished mahogany table, sunlight streaming through tall windows that illuminated the orderly stacks of documents before them. Robert asked how the wedding had gone, and Margaret paused briefly before answering that it had been beautiful and very well funded. The phrasing was deliberate. She removed the folded name card from her folder and placed it gently on the table between them. Robert adjusted his glasses and read the single word printed in gold script, then looked back at her without speaking. Margaret explained the sequence of events in calm detail, describing the expansion of the budget, the language used in speeches, the positioning in photographs, and the subtle shift in how her role had been defined. She did not raise her voice or assign accusations. She simply presented facts, as one might outline financial performance over a fiscal year. Robert listened carefully, then opened her trust documents and began reviewing the existing structure, which included provisions for Daniel, Emily, and future grandchildren, as well as a discretionary fund Margaret had established to support family milestones. "What would you like to change?" he asked. Margaret folded her hands and replied that generosity should be intentional, not assumed. She requested that the discretionary fund require written proposals and clear acknowledgment of purpose, rather than informal expectations. She asked that distributions for non-essential expenses, including luxury travel and event enhancements, be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Most importantly, she instructed Robert to revise her primary estate plan so that contributions could be redirected toward charitable foundations she had long supported, should she determine that respect within the family had diminished. Robert nodded, making notes in precise handwriting. He confirmed that such revisions were entirely within her rights and could be implemented immediately with updated signatures. Margaret reviewed each page methodically, ensuring every clause reflected her intentions. There was no bitterness in her expression, only composure sharpened by experience. When she signed the final document, the pen moved steadily across the paper, a simple gesture carrying significant consequence. As she left the office just after 11, the air felt lighter, and the weight she carried was no longer confusion but clarity. She understood that boundaries are not punishments, they are definitions. And for the first time since the reception, she felt that her role had been reclaimed, not through confrontation, but through structure. 3 days after the meeting with Robert Hayes, Margaret was arranging fresh white hydrangeas in a glass vase on her kitchen counter when her phone began to ring. She glanced at the screen and saw Daniel's name illuminated against the morning light. She dried her hands carefully on a linen towel before answering, her voice calm and even as she greeted him. Daniel did not exchange pleasantries for long. He sounded unsettled, explaining that the travel agency handling Emily's honeymoon had contacted Lauren about an unexpected issue with the final payment. A balance that had once been marked pending was now listed as declined, and the agency required confirmation within 48 hours to secure the oceanfront suite. Margaret listened without interrupting, noting the subtle shift in his tone from casual inquiry to restrained urgency. He asked if there had been a banking error, suggesting perhaps a misplaced transfer or an administrative oversight. Margaret moved to the dining table and took a seat, folding one hand over the other before responding that there had been no error. She explained that she had reviewed her financial commitments and decided to restructure future discretionary contributions. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for her to hear Daniel's breathing change. He reminded her that the honeymoon had already been discussed and that arrangements were based on her prior support. Margaret acknowledged that fact and replied gently that support is not the same as obligation. Daniel's voice tightened slightly as he mentioned how disappointed Emily might be if plans changed. Margaret answered that disappointment is often a teacher, and that she trusted Emily would still enjoy her marriage regardless of hotel square footage or private boat excursions. Later that afternoon, Lauren sent a message filled with careful politeness, asking if they could speak about the misunderstanding. Margaret agreed to a call the following evening. When they spoke, Lauren's tone was measured, expressing surprise and concern while emphasizing how much the couple had relied on Margaret's generosity. Margaret responded with equal composure, clarifying that generosity requires mutual respect and clear acknowledgment of roles. She did not reference the wedding directly. She did not mention the photographs or the speeches. Instead, she explained that she had decided future financial participation would require formal requests outlining purpose and gratitude, rather than assumptions embedded in planning. Lauren grew quiet, then offered a restrained apology if anything had been miscommunicated. Margaret accepted the sentiment without elaboration. After the call ended, she walked to the hallway where family photographs still lined the wall. She studied the images without resentment, only recognition. The next morning, Robert forwarded confirmation that the revised estate documents had been fully executed and recorded. Margaret placed the printed confirmation inside her leather folder and returned it to the top drawer of her desk. Outside, sunlight filtered through the oak branches, steady and unchanged. Inside, the atmosphere felt subtly different, not tense but redefined. For the first time in years, Margaret sensed that the expectations surrounding her had shifted slightly off balance, and she understood that clarity, once established, has a way of echoing far beyond a single phone call. 2 weeks passed, and the adjustments Margaret had set in motion began to ripple outward in subtle but unmistakable ways. Emily and her husband still departed for their honeymoon, though the itinerary had been modified to a shorter stay in a coastal resort in Florida rather than an extended overseas excursion. Margaret learned of the change not through complaint, but through a carefully worded family group message explaining that the couple had decided to simplify their plans and focus on settling into married life. She read the message without reaction and placed her phone face down on the kitchen counter. That afternoon, Daniel arrived unannounced at her home, his expression more subdued than she had seen in years. He declined coffee and instead stood near the window overlooking the backyard, as if searching for the right place to begin. He spoke about financial pressure, about expectations that had grown larger than anyone anticipated, and about how easy it had been to assume that Margaret would continue covering whatever gaps appeared. Margaret listened without interrupting, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. When he finally admitted that he had not fully considered how the language at the wedding might have felt to her, the admission was quiet and sincere. He explained that Lauren had been focused on presentation and had not intended disrespect, yet he conceded that intention does not erase impact. Margaret nodded slowly, acknowledging the effort it took for him to say those words. She did not demand an apology, nor did she reference specific moments from the reception. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, explaining that financial support must be paired with recognition of relationship, not reduced to convenience. She clarified that her revisions were not retaliation but boundaries designed to prevent future misunderstandings. Daniel absorbed her words in silence, the weight of them settling gradually rather than abruptly. Before leaving, he walked down the hallway and paused in front of the photographs he had grown up seeing, images of family vacations, school ceremonies, and holidays around the oak dining table. The familiarity of those memories contrasted sharply with the tension of recent weeks. He turned back toward his mother and said that he had never meant for her to feel secondary in her own family. Margaret met his gaze evenly and replied that value is not something one declares, it is something one demonstrates. After he left, she stood by the front door for a moment, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted again, this time not through legal documents but through acknowledgment. That evening, Lauren sent a brief message expressing appreciation for Margaret's lifelong support and stating that she hoped they could move forward with greater awareness. The words were measured, perhaps even cautious, yet they carried a different tone from earlier correspondence. Margaret read the message once and responded simply that mutual respect strengthens families more than any event ever could. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and Margaret felt a quiet steadiness return, not triumphant but balanced, as though the scales within her household had finally been adjusted to reflect their true weight. Autumn arrived quietly in Mount Pleasant, and with it came a different rhythm to Margaret's days, one less centered on obligation and more aligned with intention. The oak trees in her backyard began shedding dry leaves across the lawn, and each morning she swept the porch herself, appreciating the steady scrape of the broom against wooden boards. A month had passed since Daniel's visit, and while communication within the family had grown more measured, it had also become more thoughtful. Emily called one Sunday afternoon from their new apartment in Raleigh, describing the modest balcony garden she was planting and the simple joy of assembling furniture together without the pressure of expectations. She thanked her grandmother not for a trip or a check, but for teaching her how to save, how to budget, and how to choose stability over display. Margaret listened with quiet satisfaction, hearing in her granddaughter's voice a maturity that no luxury package could purchase. Later that week, Margaret attended a charity luncheon at the Charleston Cultural Arts Center, a cause she had supported for years but never fully prioritized. This time, when the program director thanked donors, Margaret's name appeared on a screen not as an anonymous benefactor but as a patron recognized for sustained commitment. The applause was polite and professional, yet it carried a tone different from the wedding reception. It acknowledged presence as well as contribution. Margaret did not linger in the spotlight. She returned to her seat and listened to the student musicians perform, reflecting on how freely she could choose where her resources flowed. At home that evening, she opened the drawer containing her updated estate documents and reviewed them once more, not out of doubt, but reassurance. The language was clear, balanced, and deliberate. Boundaries had not diminished her generosity, they had refined it. Daniel and Lauren began inviting her to smaller gatherings, dinners where conversation extended beyond logistics and finances. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic declarations, but there was a noticeable shift in tone. When Lauren asked Margaret's opinion about a holiday menu or a future family trip, she waited for the answer rather than assuming consent. The changes were subtle, yet consistent. Margaret understood that respect does not arrive in a single sweeping gesture. It builds gradually through repeated acknowledgment. One crisp afternoon, she framed the name card she had once tucked into her purse and placed it inside a simple shadow box in her study, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a marker of transformation. It represented the moment she recognized the difference between being valued and being utilized. Standing by the window as the sun dipped behind the trees, Margaret felt neither bitterness nor triumph. She felt steadiness. The family still gathered, still celebrated milestones, still relied on one another in practical ways, but the definitions had shifted. Margaret was no longer a silent source of funding. She was a matriarch with structure, with intention,